Good morning. This is the third series in the story of Rama, the Ramayana. And so we begin by contemplating a little bit the story and the events and the divinity of Sri Rama and Sita. But we can repeat, of course, together the normal prayer that is said in this Vedanta series overall, and that is teacher-student prayer, that we may be protected in our learning, that our knowledge be nourished, and so on. So, Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavai Tejasvinavaditam Mastuma Vidvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both. May we work together with great energy. May our studies be illumined. May we not unnecessarily cabal with each other. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. And just to recap a little bit, there are some very famous historical epics in the history of humanity. And if we understand Swami Vivekananda's take on the civilization, the roots of it, and the spread of it, we can identify ancient Greece as a root of Western society, and we can identify India as a route to Eastern society. And there is, unfortunately, historically, an emphasis on Western cultural roots and their manifestations of epics, such as Homer's Iliad, the Odyssey, but maybe not so much on the equivalent epics that are to be found in India, namely the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Ramayana, of course, is older, probably about 7,000 years old. And just to tell you that it is itihasa, that is a historical account, just as we take the Greek epics also to be historical. But we can derive tremendous lessons from them and also see what is the intellectual, cultural, and spiritual orientation of both of these societies from these great epics. Last week, we were poised at a moment where King Dasaratha was contemplating the marriage for his sons, actually more particularly for his eldest son Rama. So many years had passed where the four brothers, and the four brothers, don't forget, the king's wives were given this special payas, the special rice pudding, as it were, that was delivered from the fire by an angelic force, and proportionate to the amount of payasam that was consumed by the queens, in proportion to that, roughly, the sons were born. We can't say mathematically how it worked out, but there is a lesson even within this. And the lesson is that whatever we receive in terms of divine grace, that proportionately will arrive to us in our own life. In other words, what we absorb, in the language of this story, what we drink, what we absorb, is really what we manifest in any and every area of our life. Most students of religion, or people growing up with any kind of values from very young, would have maybe grown up thinking that it is the priestly community that is competent to give instructions of spiritual life or moral and ethical directions. But if we go to the Srimad Bhagavad Gita, we can see that the Lord's statements about this spiritual process called yoga is quite unmistakable, because he's really appealing to the kshatriya or the military or the administrative saints. And it's only the saintly ruler or the saintly rulers who can canalize society's energies along healthy and virtuous lines. We have lost this understanding in modern life, and I pointed this out probably last week, when we take leaders and we don't care about their moral, ethical status. We don't care about how they can canalize young minds into higher and nobler thinking. And we realize that from the ancient tales of yajna, how society was structured, that it requires dedicated people who undergo certain religious ceremonies, rituals, and sacrifices, inputs into mental movements called mantras, which deliver rainfall and therefore food, and therefore will benefit to the whole of society. And from the early days, we should surely educate our children to aspire to at least good citizenship and understand what that means, so that by the age of 9, they take an independent responsibility for their own destiny, making themselves their own best friend, their own worst enemy, raising the mind up by themselves, not lowering it by themselves, understanding that their own enemy or their own friend is themselves. Well, progress comes really when young people are presented with two ideals, not just the one. One is that of the saintly preceptor, the saintly teacher, the guru, who always forgives and blesses the sinner. Turn the other cheek, Jesus says. And naturally, that arises by that person seeing the Lord of the universe, or seeing that divinity within everybody. But the second one is that of the saintly administrator. Dasaratha was a saintly administrator. Rama was in the line as a Yugaraj to be a saintly ruler. And the benefit to society, of course, is enormous. By judicious application of rewards and punishments, as any ruler might do, the king or ruler or queen makes the subjects listen to their teachers and obey them. Next month we have Guru Purnima, where we honor all our teachers, also called Vyasa Purnima, where we honor the preceptor type. So with the vigor that yoga confers, or the discipline of spiritual life, rulers will get the ability to maintain the ideal by protecting saintly teachers and also their teachings. And this now arises in a moment in the story of Rama. See, without their protecting arms, then miscreants will persecute the non-retaliating preceptors. They can't retaliate because they're in a situation, dedicated people, not resisting. Resist ye not evil, turning the other cheek, dedicated to non-injury. And if something disturbs that, their teaching becomes impossible if they don't have the protection of the administrative faculty. During the COVID crisis, it was noticeable that many things, many facilities were open, including shops that delivered alcohol, but churches were closed, temples were closed, mosques were closed, religious institutions were closed. And an avenue that people required for spiritual sustenance and assurance and reassurance was actually denied to many people. This was understood a bit later, and the necessity for these institutions to open was eventually recognized. So we have a story here amidst this great story of Ramayana that we can learn from. And the story is about the ultimate preceptor called Vishwamitra, who wasn't always of this saintly preceptor type. He was originally an administrator whose job was to protect. The story of Rama gives us a great single example of this vital need of royal protection. And so Vishwamitra is well known as the seer of the Gayatri mantra. When he took the vow of total harmlessness, then he stayed in a colony of like-minded contemplatives that we normally call ashram. And so there were in his own ashram at the time of Rama as a teenager, where his father Dasaratha is contemplating marriage for the sons to continue the progeny line and therefore the inheritance of the kingdom. But at that time, of course, there were two disruptors of the sacrifices which were there. And they managed to attack the colony that Vishwamitra was in and desecrate the altars, the sacred altars. And Vishwamitra was powerless to do anything. When we say powerless, of course he could do something. But now he's in a different role. And now, not only is he in a different role, but in a different mindset, carefully cultivated through austerities. The Vishwamitra was forced, therefore, to seek protection from the Emperor Dasaratha. And the princes Rama and Lakshmana accompanied the sage. And he duly taught them the use of weapons that he knew from his previous military life. And also from the power of thought. His vow of non-killing didn't prevent him from instructing, of course, those in military skills and normal functions, safeguard virtue, but he himself couldn't engage in it. So we can all learn really one lesson from Vishwamitra's story. As a ruler, he was a military genius. Once, of course, he visited the hermitage of Vashishta, and the sage wanted to honor the king. And the king was struck by the abundance in Vashishta's ashram. And Vashishta, of course, is Dasaratha's chief advisor. So the sage gives this king due honor, presents a sumptuous feast and many things. But Vishwamitra was wondering, how does such abundance arrive in a place that is dedicated to strict living? How can such a feast be produced? And so the story starts from there, and it's a valuable story. And during the story, there are many commentaries that can be given that will be valuable for our learning. So this is where we are. So it begins really with King Dasaratha, as I mentioned before, sitting in his palace with his ministers and the rishis who lived in Ayodhya. And he spoke to them, of course, about finding a bride for Rama. And when he thought of his sons, of course, he's thinking first of Rama. But you can imagine now a drama unfolding. A great commotion was heard outside. And a very tall rishi, very obvious by beard and knotted hair, with a great sense of dignity and with a great stern face, he arrives at Dasaratha's gates. He could have easily been a kshatriya, a warrior, just by the way he stands and his demeanor. But of course, he looks like a hermit. And though he seemed a man maybe of 50 or so, he was actually, in fact, much older than that. So this is the scene you'd have to imagine. Now, when a great sage stands at your gates, The sages, of course, in a sense, are much more powerful than the kings. And the kings, that's why the kings are there, to direct people toward the sages so that they can be taught in a meaningful way from the direct experience of the sage, the rishi. Don't forget, rishi means a seer of truth, somebody who has direct access to the inner truth, the inner wisdom of things. There can be nobody more powerful than such an entity. If such a being blesses you, the blessing is lasting. If such a being curses you, the curse is also lasting. And so there are many examples of curses and blessings amongst these great sages. Vishwamitra's arrival at Ayodhya was quite unexpected, and King Dasaratha stepped down from his throne, advanced a few paces respectfully to receive the sage. That's a necessary thing. An element of flattery has to be there, and so on. Now, Vishwamitra was originally not a sage, was originally a king, and as I mentioned, he arrived with his retinue at Vashishta's hermitage, his ashram. But he acquired his sainthood and his status as Brahma-rishi through a number of severe austerities. And in order to do that and to become something, it means you're not that in the first place. And there are many blemishes that are there. And so this is a story of humanity. In other words, all of us have blemishes. None of us are perfect. There are those who may be born perfected, what we call avatars or incarnations. We assume Rama to be one of them. Krishna, Jesus, Buddha, and so on. Some say Ram Krishna, etc. All right. But normally, these are coming with a mission, a purpose. And we saw from last week how the scene begins in parallel with Dasaratha's dilemma in heaven, if you will, where this Ravana is given boons from Brahma, that means cosmic mind, by virtue of his meditation. Meditating person is not necessarily a virtuous person, but no doubt a powerful person. There's nothing that is more powerful than thought. When mobilized, will cut through like a laser and will enable the whole environment to change at your will. But of course, power without wisdom is devastating. You can see in modern times, much nuclear power and nuclear weapons available. If you take, for example, North Korea, small as it is, insignificant in the realm of geopolitics, yet it is the fourth most powerful nuclear power on the planet at this point in time. If you unleash this power, you can destroy a whole country just through a missile launch. These are very dangerous times we're looking at today, because the question is, those people who have the capacity to exercise this, do they have the wisdom? Anyway, in fact, Vishwamitra had long exhibited his spiritual powers by starting to create another Brahma. I'll tell you that story as we go on. Vishwamitra, while he was king, once went out with his army, as I said, and chanced to visit Vashishta's ashram. Now, a more descriptive text is what I'm going to refer to. Vishwamitra, with this background of tremendous austerities and this history, is now standing at the gates of Ayodhya. The rishi was naturally cordially welcomed by Vashishta, and questioned Vashishta how he managed to supply this great feast and this wonderful hospitality. And Vashishta revealed to him that he had a cow. Sabala was the name, and explained that she was the fountain of unfailing plenty. Now here we have to resort to a little bit of background on why this would be so. This cow is also called Kamadenu. Kamadenu, Kama, meaning all your desires can be fulfilled. And we also have to take the philosophical view, what does this really mean? Now, cows are regarded as sacred in India, and there's a good reason for it, because cow represents the whole stability of an economy. A cow will pull your plow, a cow will take your goods to market by cart, and a cow supplies milk, and a cow therefore is deemed to be essential to the economy, because if you have some kind of famine, then what is chiefly supplied is powdered milk. Milk is seen to be a wonderful economic source of nutrition. In fact, my own diet of bananas and milk will testify to the fact that such a diet, theoretically, if you can take it, will supply all your nutritious needs that you really need. Milk will supply an element of varieties of vitamin B, plus fat, and plus protein. Bananas supply the rest. That's if you can digest it. Some people can't digest it. So a cow will represent a flow. How do we know that we are loved in this world? How do we know that there is a beneficent God? God meaning that being that is responsible for bringing harmony and rhythm to the entire universe, from the outer reaches of the cosmos to your own individual life, which is a mini version of it in any event. It's deemed to be something like a flow. Look at the grace of the flow of the milk of a cow. See how it simply eats grass, regurgitates it a number of times, and from that brings milk. And like a mother, gives us nutrition. And so for that reason, many rivers in India are called go this, go that. And because go means cow. And even in the Irish language, the idea of a cow, that go part, is quite similar in the Celtic tradition. So bow is as it's called, and where we get the word bovine and so on from this. And so the river Boyne, which is significant, and in County Meath, you have a whole variety of ancient sites around this, including the famous Newgrange, about 5,000 years old, in a Neolithic period. So this Boyne is a corruption of bone. So again, as a cow is a goddess, again telling us about the same concept of a flow of grace, a flow of divine grace that unremittingly flows toward us without asking any thanks. It is through divine grace that we are able to attain anything. And the most wonderful arrival of divine grace is thought itself, arriving at your own substation called your mind. So what we are really talking about is a universal supplier of all our wants and all our needs. So this Sabala is the cow of plenty, Gamadhenu, that has the capacity to supply everything. And in the hands of a sage, we can supply anything, literally anything, with tremendous potency. So naturally, well, maybe not so naturally, Vishwamitra decided that it was much more useful to possess such a cow for his kingdom than it would be for Vashishta to own it. So with that in mind, he requests politely, please give me your cow. Now Vashishta, of course, could not part with the divine cow, and he gave many reasons, and he asked the king not to press his request, please. All very polite and diplomatic at this point. But the more unwilling Vashishta was to give the cow, the more eager the king became to possess her. Now, Vishwamitra had one great flaw among many. He was prone to impetuosity and became angry quite quickly. In other words, he was human. And so, failing in his efforts to tempt or persuade the sage Vashishta to part with the cow, Vishwamitra made a silly mistake. He underestimated the power of a rishi. And Vashishta is not just a rishi, but there are ranks of rishi. Brahma-rishi is the highest. And Vashishta was such a Brahma-rishi. And so Vishwamitra became angry. What does anger come from? Thwarted desire. He wants this great power, and he sees he can't get it. So he simply orders his men to go and seize the cow. He does it by force. And Subala, in her innocence, could not understand why she was being roughly handled and seized, and she was unwilling to go away with the sage and his ashram. In philosophical terms, the cosmic mind resists the violence because truth triumphs eventually. So shedding tears, she wonders how she has offended Vashishta. Vashishta is keeping quiet. That he should just stand by and look on while she was being dragged away. The cow easily is easily put to flight. The soldiers who are trying to seize her, pretty easily. Don't forget, it's very powerful. In fact, the word Sapala means powerful. A play on words. And so easily puts to flight the soldiers and then seeks refuge at the feet of the sage Vashishta. And the sage, moved as he was by the piteous appeal of his beloved cow, who was like a younger sister to him, he says, bring forth soldiers to resist Vishwamitra's men. He simply has to command the cow. He's in control of that. In control of this cosmic mind, in other words, this source of grace. And Subala instantaneously, that is, there's no time gap in between, such is the power of the sage, does so. And the aggressors were soon put to flight. Now Vishwamitra's reaction was he was wild with rage. And he gets into his chariot and taking up his bow, he rains arrows on the soldiers that are brought forth by this cow. But their strength was also inexhaustible, and the royal forces suffered utter defeat. The sons of Vishwamitra now chose Vashishta himself, forgetting he is a sage and honored. Before it was all politeness. Now he forgets completely. Because anger does it. Anger makes you forget reason. You are out of control. And so Vashishta himself was the target. And Vashishta was the target, and all their arrows that were rained on him were simply reduced to ashes. So Vishwamitra was defeated and disgraced. Then and there, he entrusted his kingdom to one of his sons, and had this idea, is Vashishta can burn all these arrows to ashes and can defeat all these forces and is in control of this Subala by virtue of a gift from all the forces of nature. If he is so powerful, more powerful than a most powerful king with all his army at his disposal, then what is the secret? The secret is Vashishta must have done tapasya. He must have done severe austerities. He must have had tremendous self-control, and in this way gained access to power. Self-control gives you not only access on an individual basis, but access everywhere because of what I mentioned, that thought is the most powerful tool that we have. Exercising this thought, in fact, the word mantra means protecting thought. You cannot have a mantra without a corresponding concept. So he says, let me put my kingdom in the hands of all my sons and go off. Where do you go off? You go off to the mountains, the Himalayas, the most hostile environment. You go off to the cold, the traditional place where tapas is performed. And who is the embodiment of this yoga? Who is the embodiment of this tapasya? It is the Lord Shiva himself, who is the Mahayogi. And so he goes off and directs all his devotions to Lord Shiva. And simply with this in mind, nothing to do with purity, nothing to do with truth or wisdom. He's only doing it to get power. And the power is there just to subdue Vashishta. You can see, and mixed up with this is not only a determination, an application of will that will yield power, no doubt. But what is lacking is self-control from the inside. He's still angry. He's resentful. He wants to pay Vashishta back for this humiliation. In other words, egoism reigns. And as we discussed in one of our classes, ego is the great, great obstacle, the greatest difficulty, the greatest hurdle for us to overcome in the way of knowledge. But so firm and steadfast was Vishwamitra in his austerities that Lord Shiva was pleased and appeared before him. And he asked the king what his object was in performing tapas. And Vishwamitra, of course, replies, well, if you, and he addresses as Umapati, are satisfied with my tapas, let me be blessed with divine arrows and be master of every weapon. That's what I want. And Shiva grants it. Yes, you have indeed been tremendously diligent in your application of your willpower, and the will is something that moves everything, because thought, whether it's good or bad, thought yields its result. You cannot avoid it. And so Vishwamitra has all the weapons available to various classifications of heavenly beings, devas, gandharvas, rishis, yakshas, and demons, all together. All the powers of the universe are given to him. If we apply will and thinking, we get power. More power than nuclear weapons. But is there wisdom? And so there is not in this case. Swelling with pride, not only anger, but pride gets added to it. Like the ocean, Vishwamitra considered Vashishta as already vanquished. Arrogance. So he straightway made for the abode of the sage, and frightened, of course, by the fearful sight of the onrush, Vishwamitra, onrushing Vishwamitra with his great, great power, Vashishta's disciples, they run in all directions, and all the animals that are being protected by the ashram, they all run away, helter-skelter, and hit by the fire weapons of Vishwamitra. Vashishta's ashram is reduced to cinders, something like a kind of nuclear weapon applied. And Vashishta, of course, regrets the turn of events, but actually is determined to end the haughtiness of the erstwhile king, because as a sage, as a genuine rishi, Vashishta's remit is to establish order by peaceful means. But he can't allow this behavior to continue. And so he faces Vishwamitra very calmly with a weapon, a Brahma-danda, a holy staff in his hand. You see, it's not a military weapon. It's a danda, it's a stick representing Mount Meru, and it comes from Brahma. So it is not a sword, it's not a military weapon, it is the weapon of sanctity, the weapon of truthfulness. And mad with rage, on the other hand, Vishwamitra shot at him all the divine weapons he had acquired, one after the other. But they were all quenched as they approached the Rishi's staff, and they all got absorbed into the staff. And Vishwamitra had only one more weapon in his armory, and that was the most powerful of all. That was the Brahmastra weapon. Again, it's a physical weapon. And as he hurled it at Vashishta, forgetting he is a sage still, the world became wrapped in gloom as in a huge eclipse, and the very immortals trembled with fear. when we read this, we cannot help but think of nuclear weapons and the danger that they pose in this modern world. But the terrible ashtra itself was merged in the Rishi's staff that also was merged, making both it and the holy man glow with the glory they had absorbed. And Vishwamitra stood dazed, openly accepting defeat. He had no other choice. He said, of what use is the Kshatriya's might, the might of the military man, the might of physical weapons? Of what might is this when a simple staff in the hand of Vashishta has nullified all my weapons? And maybe Lord Shiva himself fooled me. His anger turns to the Lord himself. There's no alternative for me but to become a Brahma-rishi just like Vashishta. Then I'll get all the powers. Misunderstands what the qualification is for being a Brahma-rishi. Purity, nobility, sattvic outlook. Satyameva Jayati, truth alone triumphs, is the great, great watchword of modern India, derived from the Mundaka Upanishad. And so he withdraws from the field of battle and proceeds now south for more rigorous tapas. That will do it. And for years and years, he went through terrible austerities. And pleased with his perseverance, Brahma, that is cosmic mind itself, as he had bestowed on so many others in the past, presented himself before him, advising Vishwamitra that as a result of all his tremendous austerities, in other words, development of willpower. What we mean by tapas is mobilizing mental willpower. There's a reason why we call it will and power. We join these two words together. And he advised him, yes, you have gained something, all right. You have risen to the position of rishi among kings. In other words, you're not a Brahma-rishi yet. You are a Raja-rishi. Of course, Vishwamitra is disappointed. He worked hard to gain the same power and status as Vashishta. And so he, all his penance, not content with anything but the highest rank of the Brahma-rishi, he now subjects himself to still more rigorous austerities so that he might be acknowledged an equal of Vashishta. Now the story now takes a different turn, and chapter 3 in the Balakandam is dedicated to this side story, what to do now. So a small sub-story has to be arranged for a background to this, and it happened to be that this particular time there was a famous king of the Solar dynasty, Trisanku, and he was reigning, but he had one great flaw, and we can see this reenacted also in Greek drama. And the flaw was he was in love with the beauty of his own body. And so he couldn't bear the thought of parting with it on death. And so he desired to enter into heaven with this beautiful body. Is it possible? Now, of course, the moment I say this, you yourself, the listener, understand this is not possible. This resurrection of the body in its current condition is a physical impossibility because the body is made from physical aggregates, material things. And look how we are all suffering from this egoism, which primarily is our attachment to our own body. Whether it's beautiful or not, that's another thing. Vashishta, his preceptor, was consulted. And don't forget, Vashishta now is the mortal enemy of Vishwamitra in this. And Vashishta happens to be his guru. So he goes to his guru, he approaches him for help in realizing his wish and advised him to give up the attempt. What use is it? So Vashishta tells him, This is impossible. Don't go for a thing which is impossible. But dissatisfied with the Vishishta's response, again you see an arrogance, a certain pride. The king approached the sage's sons. Maybe his sons will tell me, will give some light on this. If the father won't do it, maybe the sons will do it. And he looked for their help. But they were unwilling at being asked to do something which their father had pronounced impossible. And they started ridiculing him. It's a funny thing, you're doing. They ridiculed his vanity, chiefly, and curtly bade him begone. In other words, their flaw was the flaw of youthfulness, not having the wise diplomacy of their father. Okay, King Trisanku wouldn't give up his aim and told them that since they and their father were too poor in merit to help him, you're not powerful enough. I don't think you earn the right to advise me in this way. He went to find others who were richer, and Vishishta's sons were provoked beyond endurance and gave him a curse. Now don't forget, a curse from a rishi will remain because they are dedicated to truthfulness. And that means a word will be uttered, it will always come true. So they cursed him to have the body of a Chandala. What is a Chandala? It's the offspring of somebody of a certain status. Let us say, for example, a Brahmin woman who marries below her status. And the result of that, society will reject that offspring. And so Chandala is the lowest possibly in society, and society don't accept it. And so this curse is quite serious. And it began to act. So the next morning, when the king wakes up, he finds himself a different person altogether, and his physical beauty is gone. He becomes something like an untouchable. He becomes deformed. He has dirty clothing instead of royal clothing. And his ministers and his people couldn't even recognize him. From their point of view, the king has disappeared, and here's somebody else. And so he is driven out of his kingdom, and he wanders, hungry, weary, rejected, almost to death, till his destiny takes him to the great opponent of Vashishta, Vishwamitra, who has by now, of course, an ashram. And Vishwamitra looks at the king's appearance, and it actually moves his heart. And he inquires, "Aren't you King Trisanku?" He recognizes something of him. "What has brought you to this plight? Whose curse brought this upon you?" And then, of course, Trisanka recounts all the events and says, in mitigation, self-mitigation, "I've been a good king. I've never swerved from the path of dharma. I have committed no sin and wronged none." In other words, the lesson for us is this. Sometimes when we are angry or proud or arrogant, we don't recognize it in ourselves. And much of our behavior is what we call a psychological projection. That is, we don't like something in others if we don't like it in ourselves, but also we don't recognize it fully. We think it's normal. So we're looking at all the external deeds that we do, not recognizing the internal quality of our spiritual life. And so he makes this excuse. "My preceptor, my guru and his sons, they've deserted me, and on top of that, they've also cursed me. And that's why you see me, as you see me before you." And so Vishwamitra not only takes pity on the king, but he decides that this great weakness of his should be engaged, namely impetuousness. He was impulsive, Vishwamitra, and easily overpowered by emotions like anger and unwarranted sympathy and what seems to be love, but misplaced. Because really underneath it, He's saying, oh, Vashishta did this to you, I can get back at him. Because I'm quite powerful now. I'm a Raja-rishi. So in sweet words, he made the king happy by flattering. O king, I have heard of your righteous rule. I agree with you. I offer you refuge. But don't be afraid. I'll arrange for the sacrifice which will enable you to enter for you to enter heaven in your own body. That is, I'll mobilize the same machinery that King Dasaratha mobilized to get 4 sons. Knowing the secret, the mechanism of manipulating the universal forces as you want, I can arrange this machine called a yajna or a yaga. And we'll get what you want despite your guru's curse. And you can be absolutely sure of this. And so he makes arrangement for a great and unprecedented yaga or yajna. And Vishwamitra directs his disciples to invite all the sages and their disciples for this proposed ritual, this fire ceremony. And they're all afraid to say no, because they know by now the power that Vishwamitra has. And also how it can be mobilized against him quickly because of his anger. And they took it not as a request, but more or less a command. And so all the rishis agreed to be present. But of course, those who agreed not to be present were the sons of Vashishta, and of course Vashishta himself. They declined the invitation. And they made merry. They had a good deal of fun with this. They ridiculed it. They thought that the yajna would be useless, and being officiating priest was a once upon a time kshatriya, being a priest now, but he was a military man previously. So it's a little bit of funny thing. There's a comic aspect to this. And then, of course, the person for whose benefit this was really a stinking, lowly Chandala. The whole thing had comedy in it for them, a kind of satire. But this reply, duly conveyed to Vishwamitra, we can imagine, exploded into a curse that Vashishta's sons, they die. When they die, they'll be reborn for 7 generations in some kind of lowly tribe that were given to eating dog's flesh. We know throughout the civilized world, be it East or West, that the great prohibition in terms of meat was you avoid eating carnivores. So you don't eat dogs. And another prohibition in the West was don't eat horses. And okay, what about pigs? Pigs are omnivores. Well, in the Christian world, Christian Western world, you eat the omnivore, the pig, because the Jewish people don't eat pigs, and that's what distinguishes the Christians from the Jews, that they willingly eat the pork. And so anyway, this curse was there. You can see the power of curses. But the sage then began his ceremony, his yajna. And extolling Trishanka's eminent virtues, Vishwamitra seeks the help of all the other rishis in effecting the bodily translation of Trishanka to heaven. Well aware of the sage's mighty powers and voluminous temper, the invitees lent their support, and the yajna goes on. I think behind it they understand this is going to be ineffective. They're afraid to say so. Now look at the state of ourselves sometimes in the world. We sometimes agree when we know we shouldn't. We agree to be co-conspirators in something that is not virtuous, just to please the other person. We see this on the world stage too, the world of diplomacy, false flattery, and the world of propaganda also. Anyway, the whole thing reached the stage when all the deities, all the powerful forces of the cosmos were invoked to descend accept the offerings. This is how the machine of the yajna works. But none of them came. And in the mythological context, we put this as devas or gods. None of them came to attend. Without their help, nothing happens. So it was clear that Vishwamitra's yajna was a failure, and a humiliating failure at this. And the rishis who had attended the ceremony laughed within themselves. They were secretly glad at Vishwamitra's discomfiture. Wild with rage, Vishwamitra holds the ladle of ghee over the flames and said, O Trishanku, here behold my power. I now transfer for your benefit all the merit that I have earned through all my austerities. That has some potency. And if my austerities have any value, they should lift you to heaven in your physical frame. I don't care if the universal forces reject my offerings. Trishanku, king, please ascend. And at that point, a miracle follows. To the astonishment of all those assembled, Trishanku, in his Chandala form, rises up bodily into heaven, and the world saw the power of Vishwamitra's tapas, his austerities. Trishanka reaches heaven called Swarga. But Indra, who is the king of this region, he pushes him down saying, who are you, entering my region of heaven with a Chandala body? You fool that earned the curse of your guru, go down again, please. And so Trishanka falls from heaven, head down, screaming, Vishwamitra, Vishwamitra, save me, save me. And Vishwamitra, seeing this, was beside himself with rage. Determined to teach the gods a lesson, he shouted to Trishanka, stop there, stop there. And to the amazement of everyone, Trishanka's earthward descent comes to an abrupt halt. He becomes suspended. And he stops in midair, shining like a star. And like a second Brahma, Vishwamitra proceeds to create, through his very power, a new starry horizon to the south, as well as a new Indra and new Devas, a parallel universe. Today in modern science, we're asking, is there such thing? Can there be a possibility of a parallel universe? I was sitting with somebody yesterday, they asked this question, what about a parallel universe? Is it possible? Well, according to some physicists, yes, it's possible. And even in Swami Vivekananda's writings, we see the possibility of parallel universes, other dimensions, interwoven with our own. Why not? So, anyway, like a second Brahma, like a second creator, Vishwamitra proceeds to create a whole new starry environment. And alarmed at their supremacy now, the Devas now come to terms and humbly entreat Vishwamitra to please desist. And they say, let Trishanka stay where he is at present. That becomes a kind of star. Let the other stars of your creation shine forever, like your own fame and honor. But please, please, control your anger and be friends with us. And so this gratifies Vishwamitra into submission. And just as easily as he gets provoked, he gets appeased. That's the nature of the man. And so Vishwamitra baited his creative process. But his stupendous activities have consumed the whole of the power that he's now dedicated to this pursuit. And so he's back to square one. Anger will, and all of these other things, and desire and pride, will bring all your spiritual efforts to zero again. It destroys everything. 3 gateways of hell are there, and one of them is anger, according to the Bhagavad Gita. So Vishwamitra now proceeds westward to Pushkara and resumes his austerities. And for years and years, the rigorous tapasya continued. Now we have to admire Vishwamitra, apart from all his flaws, about his determination. his dedication, his pursuit to gain his power. And so for years, this rigorous tapas continues. But once again, as it was about to bear fruit, another thing happened to rouse his anger. And he loses his balance. And he curses his own sons. Because soon after recovering himself, he firmly resolved never again to yield to anger and resumes his tapas. He sees the danger and he now starts controlling his anger. And after many years of austerities, Brahma and the Devas appeared before him and say, "Oh, look, your tapasya has borne fruit. You're no longer in the ranks of kings. We promote you a little bit. You have become a real rishi." Having thus blessed Vishwamitra, Brahma, the bestower of all the boons, returns. But again, Vishwamitra is disappointed. A rishi? I've gone back to a rishi? And he wanted to become a Brahma-rishi because he still has this in mind, that Vashishta, I need to be Vashishta's peer. And so being acknowledged just as an ordinary rishi is just not good enough. It was a recognition as futile as the missiles of power that Vashishta's Brahmadanda had swallowed. So he decides to go on with his tapas, making it more severe than before. And the devas, the forces of the universe, they don't like this. They see how last time he made mayhem in the whole of the cosmos. And so they sent heavenly damsel, Minaka, to tempt him with her celestial beauty and allurements. And she goes to Pushkar, where Vishwamitra was undergoing his austerities, and she played to catch his eye with 100 wiles of charm and grace, dancing here and dancing there. And Vishwamitra saw her, and he was fascinated by her beauty. And so his vow was broken, and he spent 10 years in a dream of joy, forgetful of his high resolve. Such is the allurement of the senses. Awakening at last, he looked at the trembling Minaka sorrowfully and said he would not curse her. He realizes the trap. For it was his own folly, he blames himself, not her fault. As in tempting him, she was only carrying out the orders of her master. And sadly, he wended his way to the Himalayas to resume his broken tapas. You see, all our progress, very often the question is in spiritual life, when will I know? How will I know my progress? How can I measure it? As if it's something like a career or something like a goal. Well, you see, it's not like that. Because progress is never really linear. Progress is a little bit of progress, a little bit of regress. But if the overall upward trend is there with us, we'll get there eventually. It requires purity, it requires patience, it requires persistence. And so he goes back, and therefore the story says 1,000 years controlling his senses, he performed rigorous tapasya. At the request of the devas, Brahma appears before Vishwamitra and spoke to him thus very sweetly, "I now welcome you as a Maharishi, my son. Please, with your soulful tapas, confer on you that title and the sanctity it imports." But unmoved alike by gratification or disappointment now, Vishwamitra now becomes a real rishi with all the great powers, because he has conquered all the senses and he no longer has this resentment in him. And so with folded hands, in humility, having conquered anger, having conquered greed, having conquered a desire, in adoration, he asks the Father of the universe if the boon means conquest over the senses. Is that concluded? Have I achieved this? But the Creator says, by no means. but strive to subjugate the senses completely now. And he addresses him, O tiger among munis, that is, silent ones. Rishi is also silent in mind and speech. And resolved on the supreme conquest, Vishwamitra enters another 1,000 years of even harder tapas, which threw the devas into even greater consternation. So Indra called unto him the celestial damsel Rama, and enjoined on her as a vital service to the forces of the cosmos, the devas, to employ all her art to bring Vishwamitra under the spell of her charm and divert him from his purpose. And she was extremely afraid to do so. But Indra assured her that she would not be left alone, but be accompanied by the god of love, and the spirit of springtime would be with her for support. And so unwillingly she went, and she entered the precincts of the hermitage. The forest blossomed into vernal beauty, and the south wind blew gently, laden with the scent of flowers, and kokilas burst into song. Love and spring were both there to assist beauty. We can just imagine the scene now. And disturbed by stirrings to which he had long been a stranger, Vishwamitra opened his eyes and saw a smiling damsel of surpassing beauty, who seemed the very soul of the spring with its flowers and fragrance and song. And at this vision of soft voluptuousness, a white heat of anger surged through him as he recognized in it another temptation thrown in his way by the envious gods. And he cursed the temptress. What are the gods? Indriyas. These are all in us, and it's part of the mental makeup. Indriyas is the subtle form of the senses contained within the mind that operate in dream. And so, as part of the mind, when we say control of the senses, we're talking of control of that aspect of the mind. So, O Ramba, he says, for seeking to tempt me, who am striving to conquer anger and desire, be thou frozen to an image of stone for the next 10,000 years. But this explosion of rage itself made him see how far he was from the fulfillment of his own purpose, and sadly, he quit the Himalayan forests and sought the solitude of the east. He's now gone in every single direction, and there he restrained his breathing. He gives up all thought of the things of the world and performs austerities so stern that smoke and flames issued from his body and enveloped the whole universe. And then at the prayer of the panic-stricken deities, Brahma again appeared before him and hailed him as now a Brahma-rishi at last. All hail, Brahma-rishi. I am pleased with you. Blessed be your life. Vishwamitra was now happy. But humbly he said, how can I be happy unless from Vashishta's own lips I hear that I am a Brahma-rishi, at least that much. And Vashishta willingly smiles, remembering his fight with Vishwamitra, and said to him, O great sage, you have achieved the fruit of your great austerities, and now indeed, having conquered all the senses, having conquered the mind, having conquered all these desires and fears and temptations and anger, indeed you are a Brahma-rishi, my brother. And there was joy all around. And so this was a story of the sage that arrived suddenly at Dasaratha's court. And so we have to see, next week, the result of that, and how it now leads further in the overall story of Rama, and how King Dasaratha has really, out of great trembling and fear and respect, a mixture of all these, knowing Vishwamitra's history, knowing that he is not only capable of a word that may destroy his whole kingdom even, he now has to listen to Vishwamitra's request. And don't forget, going back, the request is, Vishwamitra is now a Brahma-rishi. He cannot engage in violence. And so he has to engage in the administrative sage, whose job it is to protect the preceptor sage. And so that's the next episode in our story of Rama. Jai Shri, Jai Jai Shri, Ramachandra ki Jai. And we continue our story next week, next Saturday. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Thank you.
Thank you, Swami.
Thank you, Swami.
Thank you, Swami.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Merci beaucoup, Swami.
Thank you.